The wind off the Libyan Sea hits the cliffs above Plakias like a slow hammer, and the archaeologist crouches lower into the marl, one hand shading his eyes, the other steadying himself on the warm rock. It is late summer on Crete's southern coast. The scent of wild thyme and crushed sage drifts up from the slope behind him. He is looking at a stone. It is not a stone the sea made. It is a hand axe. Symmetrical, bifacial, the kind of object a human hand shaped a very long time ago. He turns it slowly. He knows this shape. Every archaeology student knows this shape. And every archaeology student also knows that this shape on this island should not be possible. The year is 2008. The archaeologist is Thomas Strasser of Providence College, working with Eleni Panagopoulou of the Greek Ministry of Culture's Ephorate of Paleoanthropology and Speleology, and Curtis Runnels of Boston University. By 2010, they will publish in the journal Hesperia. They will argue, quietly and carefully, that the stone tools they are finding in the cemented beach terraces of Plakias are between 130,000 and 190,000 years old. They will argue that someone made them, and they will argue that someone, whoever they were, was not anatomically modern. Crete has been an island for about 5 million years. Not since the Messinian salinity crisis ended has anything walked dry-footed from Anatolia or the Peloponnese onto this limestone spine in the eastern Mediterranean. The deep trenches that surround Crete are deep enough that no glacial sea level drop has ever drained them. To stand on Plakias as an archaic hominin, you would have had to cross open water. Not a river, not a tidal flat, open sea. That is the settled belief this script is about to reframe. Only Homo sapiens, only us, the cognitively modern species, crossed open ocean. That is what the textbook said for a century. The first proven sea crossing in human prehistory was the colonization of Sahul, the Australia-New Guinea landmass, around 65,000 years ago, by modern humans with rafts or simple boats. Before that, nothing. Archaic humans walked. They did not sail. Then, Strasser picked up a hand axe on a beach terrace that geologists had dated to the Middle Pleistocene. Hold that image. A man on a windy cliff in Crete holding a tool older than our species' arrival in Europe, on an island no archaic hominin should have been able to reach. The Libyan Sea below him grinds quartz into the same beach where, perhaps, a different kind of human once stood with the same stone in hand. The single haunting clue is the hand axe itself. Not one, not two. By the end of the Plakias survey, the team had documented over 2,000 stone artifacts from at least 9 localities around the Preveli Gorge, the Shinaria Cliffs, and the small bays west of the Plakias resort strip. The forms were Apuleian and Mysterian, the toolkits associated with Homo heidelbergensis and Neanderthals on the European and African mainland. Pear-shaped bifaces, pointed cleavers, Levallois cores struck in a pattern that takes years for a napper to learn. These were not pebbles. These were curated objects, and they were embedded in, or eroding out of, geological deposits that the team correlated with marine terrace levels dated by speleothem and tectonic uplift studies to at least 130,000 years before present, with some surfaces possibly reaching back to 190,000. That is the haunting clue. A signature in stone, a tool tradition, a hand. No bone, no skull, no DNA. Because here is the honest part of the story. From these Plakias horizons, there is no ancient DNA. The preservation conditions on a hot Mediterranean island, with bones tumbled in marine gravels and baked by Cretan summers for over 100 millennia, are very nearly the worst conditions imaginable for genetic recovery. No mitochondrial sequence has been pulled from a Plakias hand axe maker. No Y chromosome haplogroup whispers out of these cliffs. What we know about who might have made these tools comes from elsewhere. From the Cima de los Huesos pit in Spain, where Homo heidelbergensis, mitochondrial DNA was recovered in 2013 and surprised everyone by clustering near Denisovans. From the Mesmaiskaya cave in the Caucasus, where Neanderthal genomes anchor a deep European archaic lineage. From Vindija and Altai, where the Neanderthal nuclear genome was assembled. The deep evolutionary tree is real, but it is not anchored on Crete. Crete only has the tools. When the 2010 Hesperia paper appeared, the reaction in the discipline went through several stages, and none of them were silence. First came the failed theories, the polite ones. Maybe the tools were not as old as Strasser claimed. Maybe they were eroding down from younger deposits and only looked Middle Pleistocene because of where they landed. Maybe they were Acheulean style, but actually made by anatomically modern humans much later, perhaps as recently as the Upper Paleolithic, or even Neolithic, in a kind of accidental morphological convergence. Maybe Cretan flint just happens to fracture in shapes that mimic ancient bifaces. Maybe the stratigraphic correlation was wrong. The team had not run direct radiometric dates on the tools themselves, because you cannot directly date a piece of struck chert. The age came from the marine terrace context, and marine terraces on tectonically active coasts are tricky things. Each of these alternatives was raised. Each was answered. None has been definitively refuted, and none has definitively buried the original claim. That is where the dead end sat for a while. Tools without makers. A date without a direct measurement. An island that should have been empty of any human before about 9000 BC, suddenly producing a deep time archive that nobody could quite explain away, and nobody could quite confirm. Then the modern breakthrough, slower than a breakthrough usually is, more like a tide coming in. Through the 2010s, other Aegean islands started yielding their own surprises. Naxos. Stellida on Naxos, excavated by Tristan Carter of McMaster University, produced Middle Paleolithic and possibly Lower Paleolithic stone tools in stratified contexts dated by optically stimulated luminescence. Lesbos, Rhodaphnidia, worked by Nena Galanidou of the University of Crete, produced Acheulean hand axes in deposits potentially older than 500,000 years. Suddenly, Placius was not alone. The Aegean, long imagined as a barrier, started to look like a corridor, or at least, a chain of stones across which something was moving. The investigation built. Strasser and Runnels argued, in subsequent papers through the 2010s, that the Acheulean signature at Placius was consistent with Homo heidelbergensis, or an early Neanderthal population, not modern humans, who do not appear in the European archaeological record until roughly 45,000 years ago. The tools were too old, in their reading, to be ours. So if they were not ours, and they were on an island that had never been connected to a mainland in 5 million years, then the makers had crossed water, not as castaways on a single piece of driftwood. The Placius inventory is too large, too varied, too widespread along the southern coast to be one accidental arrival. It looks like a population. A small one, maybe, but a population that came, stayed, made tools, and left those tools where the sea would eventually expose them again. The mechanism is the part where everything gets uncomfortable. The only proposed route is short open water crossings, perhaps from Anatolia southward through the Cyclades, hopping between islands that, during glacial low stands, were larger and closer together than they are now. The problem is that even at the lowest sea level minimum of the last several glacial cycles, Crete remains separated by roughly 40 kilometers of open water from the nearest Cycladic landfall. 40 kilometers is not a swim. 40 kilometers is not a wade. 40 kilometers in the eastern Mediterranean, with its currents and its sudden, Meltemi winds, is a deliberate crossing on something that floats and steers. That is what the lithic evidence implies, if the dating holds. Not the first sailors, much older sailors than we imagined. Not modern humans alone in their cognitive capacity for the sea. Something archaic, with intent, with knowledge of buoyancy, possibly with reed bundles or hollow logs lashed together, possibly with a mental map of an island they could see on a clear day from a high point on the mainland. Skeptic balance, because controversy is the story here, and the skeptics are not villains. They are working scientists making honest arguments. Carl Wegman of North Carolina State University and others have published geological reassessments suggesting the marine terrace correlations may overestimate the age of the tool-bearing deposits at some Placius localities. Other researchers have pointed out that Acheulean-style bifaces continued to be produced in some regions long after the technology had been abandoned elsewhere. meaning a hand axe shape alone does not lock in a Middle Pleistocene date. The absence of any hominin skeletal remains from Crete in this period is, for many specialists, a serious problem, not because absence proves absence, but because a population substantial enough to leave thousands of tools across a long coastline should have left something else. A tooth, a finger bone, anything. Strasser and Panagopoulos have answered most of these critiques in print, with measured language, in journals. The debate is alive. It is not a fight. It is a slow, careful argument in scholarly Greek and English about marine terraces and lithic typology, and what kind of evidence is sufficient to overturn a long-standing assumption about which humans could cross which seas. The hard evidence twist is not a single new bone or a new genome. It is the accumulation. Stelida on Naxos has produced thousands more tools, some in datable contexts. Rhodaphnidia on Lesbos has produced hand axes whose age, if confirmed, would push Aegean hominin presence well beyond 500,000 years. The Plakias claim no longer sits alone. It sits inside a regional pattern that is becoming harder to dismiss as a series of coincidences. If even one of these sites is securely dated to the Middle Pleistocene with archaic toolkits, then the assumption that pre-modern humans were land-bound dies quietly, without anyone needing to declare it dead. Walk into the small archaeological museum near Plakias, or into the larger collections in Rethymno and Heraklion, where some of these artifacts now rest. In glass cases under cool light, and you can stand a meter from the stones themselves. They are not impressive in the way a gold mask is impressive. They are grey and brown. They are the size of a fist or a palm. The edges are still sharp enough, in places, to cut skin. The light from the museum window falls on a hand axe at an angle, and you can see, suddenly, the negative scars where a napper, sitting somewhere on this island, sometime before our species had even left Africa, struck flake after flake until the symmetry was right. There is a person in those scars. We do not know their name. We do not know their species. We do not have their DNA. We have only the place their hand stopped. That is the warmth in this story. Not awe at the strangeness of it. Recognition. Whoever they were, they knew what they were doing. They had a goal. They had a tradition. They taught someone, and that someone taught someone else for long enough that the technique lasted across generations on an island in a sea. And they had crossed water to get there. That is the part that will not let archaeology sit still. The traditional model said the Mediterranean was a barrier until our species invented boats. The Plakias evidence, if it holds, and the if is real, says the Mediterranean was a barrier that was already being crossed by hominins, who, in every other measure, we considered cognitively below us. Homo heidelbergensis, early Neanderthals, the species whose mitochondrial DNA at Cima de los Huesos surprised us in 2013 by sitting closer to Denisovans than to later Neanderthals. The species whose toolkits we describe as conservative, whose minds we imagine as practical rather than imaginative. Those minds, the Plakias hand axes suggest, looked at the sea and did not stop. The reframe is gentle, because the science is still gentle about it. The Plakias finds do not overturn the human story. They complicate it. They reopen a question we thought was closed. They expand the geography of archaic hominin range into places we did not think those hominins had any business being. They rewrite, slowly, the chapter where modern humans get sole credit for everything difficult. For art, for language, for the sea. There is, here, no DNA to seal the case. There may never be. The conditions on Crete are not the conditions of a Siberian permafrost cave or a cold Spanish karst. But absence of genetic evidence is not absence of human evidence. The tools are evidence. The thousands of them, across 9 sites, embedded in old marine deposits, are evidence. The pattern across the wider Aegean is evidence. And the simple geometric truth that Crete has been an island for 5 million years, and the tools are still there is evidence of something, of someone, of a crossing that happened. Stand again above the Plakias coast at the end of a summer day. The thyme and sage are still there. The wind off the Libyan Sea is still there, slightly cooler now as the sun drops toward Africa. The cliffs are the same cliffs Strasser stood on in 2008 when he picked up a stone that should not have been on this island. Somewhere on this coast, more tools are still in. The rock waiting for the sea to expose them. Somewhere, possibly, a hominin bone is still in the rock too, waiting for someone to find it and finally close a question that has been open for nearly 2 decades. Until then, the story stays where Strasser and Panagopoulou and Runnels left it. Honestly contested, carefully argued, still standing. A figure on a beach, a very long time ago, holds the stone that another figure, much later, will pick up and turn slowly in the wind. 2 hands across 100,000 years, and a sea neither of them was supposed to have crossed. If this story sits with you, this channel is working through the strange, contested edges of the human story, one site at a time. The bones. Nobody can place. The tools in the wrong places. The DNA that rewrites a region. Subscribe quietly if you want the next one. There is a site in southern Italy with a similar problem. There is a cave in the Caucasus with a tooth that does not fit. The series continues. The sea, as always, keeps its older answers to itself.